Alright, I know a day late and a dollar short, but I've been a little busy. Let me first start off by saying that Star Wars to me is a lot like pizza. It really can only be so bad, and even the worst slice is still palatable. I'm often accused of not being able to be objective when it comes to Star Wars, but I disagree respectfully, and I think this review might prove it. I have a very difficult time talking about this sort of stuff and remaining spoiler-free. If you are at all concerned about spoilers, my advice is don't watch this review. I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything, but one man's, this isn't really a spoiler, is another man's complete spoiler. My general rule with spoiler-free reviews is that I'm not going to talk about anything you wouldn't already know or presume from the trailers or from marketing material you see in the stores. We'll definitely be talking about the spoilery elements of this movie on next week's Nerd Rage Radio. Available both on iTunes and YouTube. Let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and of course, we'll start with the good. The best thing about this movie and what this movie really has working for it to its advantage is that the movie relies on Han and Chewie working, and Han and Chewie do work. I think the young lad playing Han Solo does a really effective job of capturing the spirit of the character, which I think is most important. I think this movie would have suffered if it would have been an impersonation of Han Solo rather than trying to capture the spirit of the character and give your own performance. In comparison, I think that Donald Glover's performance is much more of a impersonation than it is what Alden seems to do. Not that Glover's performance is bad, I just find it to be a lot less interesting and enjoyable because it comes off as much more of an impersonation rather than something new on something we already love. I think that Alden's performance was the most concerning element of this movie, and I think he does a good job. And that helps make the movie not a failure. The other good thing, at least for Chewbacca fans, is that Chewbacca gets a lot of screen time, a lot of action, and a lot of heartfelt moments. To continue on, I think the cast overall does a very good job, and I don't really think there's a poor performance across the board. George Lucas has never really been known as an actor's director, and I think a lot of the recent Star Wars films have had the luxury of having directors that actually really care about the performance, and this movie shows it as much as the others. My favorite moment of the film is the first time that Han and Chewie take seat as pilot and co-pilot of the Millennium Falcon. It's one of those Star Wars moments. Not a lot of dialogue, a whole lot of heart, and the music hitting the right beat. Speaking of beats, there's a lot of good character beats throughout, with all the familiar characters that you know and new characters that you grow to love. Another thing I really like about this film is I kind of feel like recently Star Wars has been making a conscious effort to forget the prequels. This is one of the few movies that has come out under the Lucasfilm brand since the buyout that makes a conscious effort to supply connective tissue to all the eras of Star Wars, including Rebels and Clone Wars, and that's awesome. It has a lot of good action sequences, but one in particular works extremely well, and that is sort of the train heist scene that we see a lot in the trailers. Definitely has that space western vibe, and I think is incredibly successful. Probably my favorite action sequence of the film. And the last thing I want to talk about with the good is there is a twist, for lack of a better term. Twist isn't really the most accurate way to describe what I'm talking about, but what I am talking about is a jaw-dropping, oh no they didn't, Yoda's using a lightsaber type of moment. The bad. The biggest problem with this movie is a problem that many of us were concerned about, and one of the reasons why I did the controversy behind the Solo video last week, and that is that the story structure is extremely convoluted. The actual point of the movie and the point of the story changes like 3 times throughout the course of the film. The first act seems pretty simple and straightforward, and I thought to myself, cool, this is going to be a fun ride that ties everything together and a classic approach to storytelling, at least in the Western world, and that's fine. By the second act, the main conflict of the first act is pretty much resolved, and the second act starts you on a new path. And then in the third act, a whole new element of the story is revealed, and the story kind of ends up becoming about something else that isn't resolved. And as a result, the main narrative of the film seems very foggy, to say the least. They have left it open for sequels to be displayed in a number of fashions, so it is one of those things where it could all end up just fine in the end, but as of right now, it's a little murky. Another problem I have with the movie is while there are a lot of heartfelt moments, there are big character moments, big elements to the saga that they really should have taken their time with and made hit on every emotional level possible to Star Wars fans. And I feel like some of those moments just kind of come and go. And they're sacrifice for the sake of telling the story, which I get, but since the story has so many problems of being singularly personified, those moments end up being sacrificed for something that once again is murky. I'm sure this has a lot to do with the directors changing, the writer getting involved at a certain point as kind of a backseat director, etc. A lot of this happened on Rogue One as well, but where Rogue One seems like a more singular vision, this one definitely seems like there were a few chefs in the kitchen. My other big issue that's tied to the story component is in a lot of ways, one could make the argument that by the third act, this film really is a Kira story rather than the Solo story, even though a lot of big moments for Solo happen. I am left at the end of the film thinking to myself, at the heart of what's going on here, what is this movie actually about? Han Solo and Chewbacca or Kira? And then my last main issue is throughout the history of Star Wars, and I'm talking every single Star Wars release, from A New Hope to The Last Jedi, Star Wars is known for a number of things, but to me, one thing specifically, and that's strong, easily identifiable, long-lasting, notable, memorable, impactful villains with kick-ass designs. And in this film, while the villain is acted and portrayed well, you don't really get enough of him, in my opinion, to solidify him in your mind as who he is, what he's about, what his angle is. And at the end of the day, I think that he will be easily forgotten by the fandom. And I can tell you, while having discussions about this film over the past 48 hours, I've had a hard time even remembering his name, or talking to people that did enjoy him, getting them to be able to recite his name. That, for me, is a problem when other characters whose names are barely mentioned roll off the tongue. And lastly, and I can't really hold this film accountable for it necessarily, is that while looking at the art book, which I get for every Star Wars film because they're awesome, and I highly recommend them as a side review, there are a number of designs, concepts, and ideas that I think are a lot more interesting than what we ultimately get visually in a lot of ways. My personal opinion is that Star Wars has some of the coolest character designs, planet designs, city designs, weapon designs in pop culture, and I don't feel like this movie has as much of a strong suit in that department. But it looks like it wasn't creatively bankrupt, it was ultimately the choices at the end of the day that were made. And lastly, the ugly. And there's not much ugly here. All the special effects, creatures, planets, etc., for the most part, are extremely well done, even though I think their designs may not be as interesting as we've seen in the past. There are 3 ugly components to this film, at least in my opinion. Numero uno, I do feel like Star Wars has certain unspoken rules. And when those rules are challenged or broken, it always becomes a conflict amongst the fandom, and at least a point of discussion between Adam and I on Nerd Rage Radio every week, where we pretty much find some way to argue about Star Wars at some point. One of those rules to me is that while Wookiees can communicate with non-Wookiees, and non-Wookiees can communicate with Wookiees, the Wookiee trachea is incapable of speaking the human language, and I say human for lack of a better term, and the human trachea is incapable of speaking the Wookiee language. And I don't think there is a way to get around that rule. And that rule is sacrificed, and I won't say that the breaking of that rule is done elegantly. My second ugly is, we all know this is an origin movie of sorts. And in this movie, an explanation is given as to why one of the characters carries the name they carry. I think that reason and explanation is stupid. Not, it could have been better, or slightly disappointing, or that's not how I saw it, but stupid. Stupid and dumb. Dumb act. Lastly, it's largely been presumed that we see the Kessel Run in this film, and while that is true, I think it's only true in spirit, because ultimately, it's a shadowy, dark, murky, confusing array of lights and sounds that, in my opinion, is added to the legacy of Star Wars that has something in our minds as being so great that ultimately is very challenging to fulfill what your imagination could come up with. The first concept like that springs to mind would be the Clone Wars in terms of a comparison. Let's wrap this up. My ultimate score of this movie is a 6 out of 10. I do recommend that you see it in the theater. I do think that that is worthwhile, especially for some of the surprises that are there that you wouldn't expect. And I want to say one last thing before I go. Maybe 2. The most interesting component I have found found about this movie is that people that love The Last Jedi tend to think that this movie is fine, like myself. And people that hate The Last Jedi tend to think that this movie is really good. And that's something I want to dive into a lot deeper in the future. While I think this movie is just sort of okay and passable, I still really enjoy it. I'm able to see the problems in something and simultaneously really enjoy it, as long as those problems aren't overwhelming, all-encompassing, and crippling. So I give it a 6 out of 10. It's my least favorite of the last 4 films, but I still really enjoyed it. I guess ultimately for me, it comes down to this. I like filet mignon. I like fresh tortellini in a vodka sauce. I enjoy a fine bottle of wine. And these are the types of things that I try to consistently fill my life with because of how much I enjoy them. But that doesn't mean that every once in a while I can't sit down and enjoy a Big Mac. And that's what this is to me, the Big Mac of Star Wars. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.